On this computer. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And a big thank you to Kathryn, whose book we read this month, Lost and Found, a memoir. Lots of really interesting questions, a very, very interesting book, a very different book than we've ever read, actually. Before we kick off with our questions that we've been sort of compiling over the last 3 weeks as we read it through the month of May, I want to give the floor to you, Kathryn, to just tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to writing Lost and Found, really.
Sure. Well, it sounds like you've had a couple of weeks to mull over the book, so you probably know more about me than I can, do justice to in a few moments here, because I don't want to take up too much time. But this book was an interesting project for me because although I've been writing basically all of my adult life, I mean, I wrote as a child too, but thankfully, all of that stuff was long since destroyed. I have not historically been someone who writes very much about myself. I work primarily as a critic and a reporter, so I write about other people's books and about the world at large, which isn't to say there's never, the first person in my work, but the first person is very different from being quite personal, and this was one of the first truly personal things I wrote, and that was an interesting challenge for me, and for the most part, a ton of fun and gratifying as a writer to try something quite different from what I'm used to doing. So I really enjoyed it, and of course, I hope all of you enjoyed reading it as well.
So you are a journalist as well. You're still a journalist. You're not writing books full time. That's right.
Yeah, that's right. I'm still full time at the New Yorker, and I really enjoy that kind of work and kind of the variety of subjects to think about it affords me. And it's, every once in a while it's nice to venture off into bookland, but by and large, I'm pretty happy at magazine length.
Okay, so let's venture into this book specifically, because this is like completely different than what, like you said, completely different than what you normally write. Especially being a book critic, like that's a whole other area we can explore. But why did you feel like it was time to write this book specifically?
It's an interesting question, and some of it is truly just about what was happening in my life. I lost my father in 2016, and I did actually write about that for the magazine. Some of this book, the first part of this book, the lost part, grew out of an essay I wrote for the magazine called Losing Streak that was partly an elegy to my father, but partly, it was kind of a strange little elegy because it was, even at that short length, an exploration of this larger category of loss, and kind of grappled with this question of why that category is very weird. Why would we put our beloved father and our missing iPhone and the sock that never emerged from the wash cycle in the same category? That's a strange thing. So I did write about it a little bit, and actually had no intention at first to expand it into a book. And then at some point I found myself thinking about the kind of mirror image of that category of loss, which is this category of discovery. And of course, I had fallen in love shortly before I lost my father. And having written this quite sad little piece, I was drawn to writing about the joy in life, and drawn to writing about how we reckon with the fact that the joy and the grief are always commingled. They're not necessarily as proximate as they were in my life when I fell in love and lost my father, but all of us are always dealing with many, many emotions and experiences at once, and that felt exciting to me to grapple with that, not just to tell my own personal story, although it's very fun to write a love story, but to get to think through these ideas at greater length than I would in the magazine and in a more personal context. So I think it was just kind of the moment in life.
And I do want to explore sort of the characters in the memoir a little bit more too. But before I ask that, how was it moving from writing what you typically write, like an essay format, to having to write this entire memoir? Was that difficult? Did it come easy?
You know, It's interesting. It was not difficult in the way many people think it would be. You know, I often get asked, "Oh, was it hard to write something so personal after mostly working as a journalist?" Or, you know, was it hard to write about grief at such length? Because, of course, that's a very emotional subject. And the truth of the matter is, the answer to both of those questions is no. I found that most of the I would almost venture so far as to say all of the writing challenges that I encountered in working on this book were quite familiar to me. You know, they felt like the same kinds of challenges you experience as a writer, almost no matter what you're taking on. And those are, you know, challenges about structure. You know, how does a book work? What's the most robust and elegant shape you can put your ideas into? How do you capture an idea on the page? How do you craft a beautiful sentence? And those are very familiar challenges. They're fun challenges. I love taking them on, but they weren't drastically different than what I feel like I do every day.
So we do have a question from Terry here, and it's a good segue into actually your character, well, your partner, Casey. Is it Cassie or it's Casey, isn't it?
Mhm, Casey, yeah.
Casey, sorry. So Terry wants to know why you use C instead of her full name.
That's a terrific question. And you know, it's interesting. I am sure there are readers who object to that choice, who just don't understand why I wouldn't use the full name. And to be clear, it certainly was not an act of withholding. My partner is basically a public figure, you know, much as I am, insofar as writers are ever public figures these days, unless you're J.K. Rawlings. She is also a staff writer at The New Yorker. She is the author of her own tremendous work of nonfiction, Furious Hours, about the life of Harper Lee. So, you know, it would take one Google search to figure out who I married, you know. So it wasn't meant to be kind of a roman clay where readers are trying to figure out, you know, who is this person, and nothing like that. You know, it was partly an aesthetic choice and partly an emotional choice. The very first part of this book I ever wrote, I did not write the book in order, and the first part I ever wrote was the scene where Casey and I meet for the first time. And when I sat down to write it, I actually wrote it without any name or anything at all. I wrote it just with pronouns. It was just she and her. And to be honest, that felt exactly right, in that interesting way that when you meet someone and you're dazzled by them, there really isn't anyone else in the world. Like, you don't need any identifiers. You're totally focused on this one person, and they take up the whole frame, and so you don't need anything further than that. And it was very pleasing to write that scene that way. And then, of course, very quickly it became absolutely impossible to sustain. You know, it's literally a grammatical problem. You can't just use pronouns, or at some point it's not clear, are you talking about the woman you just met? Are you talking about your mother? Are you talking about the cat? Like, you have to get more specific than that, or you're going to really confuse your readers. And that's when I started using C. And to be honest, I wasn't sure if I was going to stick with that decision clear through to the publication of the book. But ultimately it felt right to me. And it felt right to me for two reasons. One is that it was incredibly generous of Casey to let me write this book and let me sustain me in it, champion me in it, help me in it, read every page of it many times, because she is a much more private person than I am. And so part of that decision was a tiny gift to her, you know, just a way of acknowledging the fact that she herself would probably not choose to be fully present in the pages of a book. And part of it was a little bit of a nod to the nature of memoir in general, which is, even when you're not withholding any grand secrets, which I'm certainly not, you know, everything you read in the book is true, everything relevant to my relationship is in the book and present. You're never telling the whole story, right? You're creating a narrative, you're creating an arc. In my case, you're serving a set of ideas. Like, I wanted to explore these ideas about finding and losing and conjunction, this kind of connected nature of things. And so that shaped my choices. So, you know, I think readers kind of feel like, oh, you're meeting everyone and you're getting this whole person. And I wanted this little acknowledgement of like, well, actually, no, you know, you get the first little bit, you get what kind of comes first, you know, but everything else belongs to me and belongs to her and to her family and so forth. So some of it was just a little bit of a nod to the form. But as I said, I'm sure it's very annoying to some readers. And if, you know, Terry, if you're one of them, I apologize.
Yeah, so well, that was sort of my question about Casey and how obviously huge parts of her life are included in the story. And so was that like a twist her arm situation, or was that just a trust in you that you would tell the story? And that, like, I'm sure, and based on the relationship that we saw, obviously very loving and respectful, it didn't feel very far-fetched, even knowing she's a private person.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't a twist your arm situation. And if it had been, I never would have written this book. I never would have gotten as far as twisting an arm, because to be honest, I don't even choose to be in that position with sources I've never met for reported pieces I'm working on. If you have to, sometimes you have to be patient with people and build relationships and build trust. But if you have to kind of, you know, render them a little uncomfortable or inflict something on them, it's not my preferred way to go. Sometimes you have to in certain kinds of reporting, but I mostly don't do that particular kind of work. So no, it was, I would say, a quite joyful collaboration. And as I said, she truly just championed the whole process at every stage in ways that I couldn't have written it if she hadn't. And I should say, not just her, and that was also true of my in-laws, of Casey's parents and her sisters, and true of my mother and my sister, and my family, that obviously this story is also their story in part, and they have different versions of it and lived through different bits of it, but it's very much deeply connected to their own lives. And I'm so grateful to everyone in the book who just never for a moment hesitated in their support of it.
That's great. Just funny, Terry. Terry was listening to it, so she actually thought her name was C. Like,
Oh,
but the question came from the bigger book club.
gotcha. It's true. I never thought about how in the audiobook version, although I myself read it, it never occurred to me that for a reader coming to it for the first time, it wouldn't be entirely clear how that was rendered on the page.
Yeah, so the very beginning of the book explores the very real and very difficult emotion that is grief. And did you have a plan or a hope for this book in terms of that emotion, or where grief is concerned?
To the extent that I had a plan in that sense, not about how to write it, but about how it would be received once it was out in the world. I certainly hoped and continue to hope that it would find readers who needed it. And that's true of the love story too. When I wrote this book in part because although I read just vast quantities of things about grief before I sat down to write it, I didn't quite read what I needed to read. And I set out to write that thing. And when I tried to read about love before sitting down to write this book, it's very, very hard actually to find a contemporary love story that doesn't end badly, in tragedy or divorce or some kind of dissolution of the bonds of love. And that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to write about the texture of ongoing happiness and about what happens after you fall in love and after you commit your life to someone, and what that's like. So with both the grief and the love, I felt like there was a kind of contemplation of these essential parts of life that I myself hadn't been able to find when looking for it. And I cherished the idea. I've been so comforted by so many things I've read in my life, and I cherish the idea, and I hope it doesn't sound grandiose, of being that kind of comfort to someone somewhere, even if it's just a few people and even if it's fleeting.
I feel like it can't be grandiose. You must have received so many emails of people who have read this, who have helped, this book has helped them, like in times like we that's a lot of feedback that we got where people were reading it. Like sometimes books find you right when you need them, right?
Mm.
And it might not be a book that they would have picked up normally, but it found them at the right time. So
yeah, I've been very, very moved to hear from readers when they finish the book, or sometimes midway through, and to feel like, okay, yeah, for some people out there, this was the right book at the right moment. And again, sometimes that's because someone has lost someone very dear to them, and needed someone to articulate some piece of that experience, whether it's sitting in a hospital or how it feels, over the holidays when you first lost someone you love. But also, I was so charmed and truly moved to hear from readers who just wanted to say, I've been married to my wife for 64 years and I still dance with her in the kitchen, and your book reminded me of our early days, and I wish you a life like ours. I mean, it's so wonderful for, to hear these little bits and pieces of other people's lives.
Speaking of articulating, like, and that's what you're so brilliant at, is like articulating all these hard, not just hard, like you said, I keep discrediting the love because the grief was so moving for me. So,
Mhm.
but I know they're equally as important and equally as beautiful. But there was just one sentence you wrote: grief confuses us by spinning us around to face backwards, because memories are all we have left. But of course, it isn't the past we mourn when someone dies, it's the future. I thought that was like so well articulated, exactly what, and I just wondered if you wanted to expand on that at all.
Mhm. Sure. I mean, you know, it's funny, people, as I said earlier, sometimes ask me like, oh, was it scary to like write a memoir, to be so personal or reveal so much about your life? And my feeling was always like, no, that wasn't scary at all. But you know what is scary? What is scary is deciding you're going to write a book about love and grief. Like
Yeah.
these are like not small topics. And also, it's been done before, including by some of the greatest writers in history. And so I did make this commitment to myself when I sat down to write the book, that I was going to do everything I possibly could to truly kind of crawl back inside the experience and figure out what it's actually like, to get beyond what we tell ourselves about grief or about love, or how we narrate it in the moment or after the fact, or what kind of language or cliches or traditions we lean on to get us through these times, and actually think, okay, but like, no, seriously, like, what is it like to sit next to your father when he's dying? Or what is it like to mourn someone? Like, what are we actually mourning there? And thank you for quoting that line, because it's a precious one to me as well, because it was one of those moments where I kind of had the aha of like, oh, it's complicated. It's not what we think it is. We're mining our past over and over and over because it's what we have, but that's not where the grief lies, right?
Mhm.
The grief is about what we no longer have. It's about the present and the future. And it's so strange to kind of inflict this absence on our past, when in fact it's an absence that's always looming up in front of us. But yes, that was the kind of one of the products of this effort to really um, just try to get as close to the actual experience as I actually could.
You describe your family as a fiercely, this is off online, it's not from the book, but as a fiercely intellectual family that is very interested in ideas. And I just wondered if you could kind of expand on that as
Yeah, I don't know who summarized my family in that way, but they're absolutely correct. Yes, I grew up in a family where ideas were kind of the coin of the realm, ideas and language, and a lot of that came from my father, as described in the book, who was just a real force of nature. I mean, had one of the most towering intellects I've ever encountered, but a generous intellect. It's possible for someone with a towering intellect to hoard their knowledge, or to intimidate other people, or to bully them, or to make them feel ashamed for what they don't know. And that is the opposite of who my father was. He was boundlessly curious about the world. He always wanted to invite other people into his ideas, his experiences, his sense of things. He wanted to know what you thought, and he wanted to have a kind of intellectual exchange. And that was true from the time I could, toddle. I'm sure, it's so funny. I have a little toddler of my own now, and um, a beautiful thing about parenting is you think about your own parents and the environment in which you were raised. And I can imagine the sentences my father was saying to me, that of course I had a very limited capacity to understand it, 20 months or whatever, but it was always there, right? This invitation into this world of ideas, and into this kind of delight and curiosity about the cosmos and everything in it, down to one another. So yes, fiercely intellectual, I think is exactly right.
I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions or you want to ask a question live, then please feel free. You can use the chat window or you can just put your hand up and I will make sure you get to ask. Can we look at your accolades now? Because there's quite a few of them. You are a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and you have 2 TED Talks. I was just wondering, what are any of those experiences like? Because those are like all in their own right, very amazing.
Thank you. That is kind of you. I mean, look, I'm not gonna lie or attempt false modesty. It was quite incredible, the Pulitzer news. I got the phone call from my boss at the New Yorker on a Sunday night, about 24 hours in advance of the announcement. I don't know who tips these people off, but someone does. And he literally said, "Are you sitting down?" And you know, when your cell phone rings and it's your boss on a Sunday evening and you're on deadline, which I actually was. Of course, my first thought was like, boy, it's really bad when your boss is like, that's actually my editor's boss, so like my boss's boss. That's bad when they're calling you on a Sunday night. You're like later on your piece than you thought you were. But then, of course, it turned out to be this really delightful news. And to be honest, the most wonderful thing about winning that prize, and those of you who've already read the book, or even the first third of it, will appreciate this. By far, the most wonderful thing about that is it happened when my dad was still alive, and I got to call both my parents and tell them. And a thing I love about my parents, and I'm so grateful to them for, is they're proud of me no matter what, and I know that. And their love for me is not contingent on, you know, whether I'm winning prizes or, you know, on anything I'm doing, good or bad. They love me through it all. But it is a real joy as the adult child of your parents to feel like you can reward their labors in this small but significant way, and in a very public way, so they get to kind of enjoy those accolades too. So that was by far the best part of it.
That's awesome. And the TED stage?
Terrifying the first time. Kind of a one of those experiences where I just kind of went into autopilot and you know, barely noticed when it was over. I believe Chris Anderson, the guy who runs it, had to literally kind of very sweetly turn me back around and like put me back on the stage afterwards to be like, you know, they're clapping, it's okay to stand there for a moment. Totally fine the second time. You know, you know, like all things, you get used to it. But yes, certainly an honor, certainly you know, daunting one, especially as I said the first time around.
Well, you must have done all right because you had 5 million views. So.
Well, I'm grateful to people. Speaking of fiercely intellectual, I'm grateful that people choose to spend their time listening to things like that, and engaging with the world of ideas in whatever way, whether that's watching a TED Talk or reading the newspaper or reading a book. It's endlessly moving to me that people want to share in other people's ideas and experiences.
So as a critic yourself, do you read your own reviews? I couldn't help but slip this one in.
I do. I'm not one of these people who's ever, I just, partly because I'm a critic, you know, I am so in touch with how capricious the whole profession is in a certain sense. And that's not to impugn any individual critics, including myself. You know, we hopefully read carefully and thoughtfully and do our best to be honest and useful about books on behalf of their potential readers, which is who you write for. Of course, you don't write for the author. But it just doesn't have, I've never, nothing lives or dies on that basis. I mean, for good or ill, for one thing, their critic has lost a lot of status in the culture. You know, it used to be, you know, the New York Times or NPR could make or break a book, and that's just absolutely not the case anymore. You know, it's in many very good ways, the world of criticism has really democratized. You know, what your rating is on Goodreads is probably far more significant than, you know, what the New York Times has to say about you. But yes, I mean, look, I'm curious. I'm curious what other people think about my work. I learned a very long time ago that you can't please all the people all the time. And sometimes you get lucky and the person who happens to be reviewing your book is somebody you pleased, and sometimes it isn't. And it's representative of pretty much nothing beyond that. So yeah, I read them. It doesn't really, I know writers who don't, and I totally respect that and get that, but I don't find it very troubling or very gratifying in either direction. Sometimes it's gratifying. I should qualify that. It's sometimes gratifying, not so much when someone praises your work as when it is obvious from the review that they absolutely understood what you were trying to do. Whether they think you succeeded or failed, if they like really see through to the book you wanted to write, that's actually a really lovely feeling, and also makes me really respect the critic. But for the most part, it's a exercise in curiosity for me, and not very it's not that I don't have any ego. I have plenty of ego, but it lives or dies on other things.
I was in London, England for a book club this month, and I have to tell you that the Brits really, really enjoyed your book.
Oh gosh. Well, I love the British edition. It's so funny. I'm actually sitting here for it's right before I sat down. I thought, gosh, I better grab a copy of my book, because you never know if someone's going to ask you a really specific question or want you to read or something. And the copy I grabbed is the British edition, which I just regard as a truly beautiful object. So I'm grateful to my British publisher, and certainly grateful to my British readers.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this, but your partner Casey has written a true crime book, and I just the name is Furious Hours, if anybody's looking out for that. And is that a genre, because is that a genre that interests you at all? Or if you were to write another book, where would we be headed?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's barely a genre that interests my partner. I think she was quite surprised to find herself writing something that very reasonably got categorized, at least in part, as true crime. For those of you who don't know it, it's an account of the nonfiction book that Harper Lee herself tried to write in the years after To Kill a Mockingbird, and after she had helped her childhood friend Truman Capote with the reporting and research for In Cold Blood. So she knew a thing or two about true crime. And she tried to write a nonfiction book about, it's an insane story actually, about a African-American preacher in a very small town in rural Alabama who murdered a great many, I should say, was alleged to have murdered a great many people for the insurance money. And so her book was partly true crime, partly about that original story that Harper Lee tried to write, but also kind of a biography of Harper Lee and these sort of lost decades of her life after Mockingbird and what she was up to down there. And then also, a deep and interesting look at the politics and sociology of the small town South in the period that this was happening and in the period that shaped Harper Lee. So she came into it kind of from the Harper Lee angle, in this incredible lost book that Harper Lee tried to write. So neither of us, I mean, it's so funny, when she sat down to write that book, she had to go read a bunch of true crime because it wasn't really her, a genre she had spent a lot of time thinking about. When I sat down to write my book, I actually had to read a ton of memoirs, because although I like them, I hadn't read that many either. So all of which is to say, in my experience, it's very hard to know what your next book might look like. I wouldn't have predicted I would write a memoir. And I have no idea what I will do next book-wise. Although I will say, someday I would like to sit down and just write a real yarn, a good old-fashioned nonfiction, but a good old-fashioned story, kind of perfect storm style. Just sit and let a beautiful tale unfold for readers. So that's what I would love to do, but you just don't know what life is going to bring you.
Because you did write another book. It was 12 years ago. You wrote Being Wrong: Adventures in the Margin of Error. And I just thought, for people that really enjoyed this book, is that another book that they should explore, or is it a total different genre? Or sort of like, can you just point our readers in, just give them a little bit of information about that one?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So, should you read that book if you enjoyed Lost and Found? It depends. Did you enjoy the parts of this book that are not just the memoir, but are thinking about this broad experience of losing and this broad experience of finding, and this interesting way that life experiences stubbornly refuse to be contained in one box? Unfortunately, we love and grieve at the same time, and we experience many things at the same time. if you liked those things, you might well like my first book, Being Wrong, because what they have in common is they are explorations of these broad categories of shared human experience. So Being Wrong is uh, partly a kind of history of how we think about error, what we think its role in our lives, individual lives and collective, the collective development of humanity, but partly very much about the actual experience of getting things wrong and how we feel when that happens and how we react when that happens. So much like exploring losing or exploring discovery, and in that case I'm exploring error and our relationship to it. And if you found those parts of Lost and Found fun, yeah, I think you might well like it. If you were in it just for the memoir, there is a lot less of that, vanishingly little of that in the first book, so it might be less pleasing to you. But no author is ever going to discourage you from going and reading their other books.
Fair enough. I would love to know, anybody, Terry did want to know what Casey thought of the book, I guess at the end when it was fully finished.
Well, as I said, she has been this kind of indefatigable champion of this book. In fact, she and I have done a number of book events together for it, which has been really, really fun. There wasn't really an at the end of it, in the sense of like a moment when I, presented her with the finished manuscript and said, "Tell me your thoughts," because she really did read it all along the way. In fact, as I was writing the found section and writing our love story, I would, write during the day and then come up to her at bedtime and read aloud to her what I had written during the day, which was a lot of fun. And so she was, there was never a kind of mystery of what I was up to, and she helped, as she always does, give feedback and suggest edits. So yes, there wasn't like the moment where I, handed it to her and then like left the house for 3 days and felt anxious or anything like that. It was she was very involved and incredibly supportive along the way, and continues to be as the book, goes out into the world, and I trot along after it doing things like this.
Very good. So just to close up, I would love to hear what we usually ask about your favorite authors or favorite books. If you can give us any recommendations on stuff that you're reading or have read that you really loved.
Oh gosh. This is such a hard question, and if I had any sense at all, I would remember to prepare for it before I do these things, because I always feel kind of caught off guard. And unfortunately, I'm in a funny moment where I haven't read anything particularly contemporary in a little while, because it's funny being a journalist and a critic, you're often reading for work.
Yeah.
So, I'm reading arcana related to articles that I'm working on, which wouldn't be of interest to anyone. But in terms of authors I really cherish, close readers of this book, I'm sure, notice that in some ways it is kind of a covert poetry anthology. I smuggled quite a lot of poetry into its pages, partly because the poets historically have done a very good job with both love and grief, and partly because I really love it. So, I do return again and again to Elizabeth Bishop or Robert Frost or Auden or Szymborska. And if you haven't read those poets, I hope the book gave you a little toehold in some of them, and you do go read it. On the fiction front, I think Marilynne Robinson is probably the greatest living author in America. And if you haven't read Gilead and its sibling novels set in Gilead, I strongly encourage you to do that. They're incredibly beautiful. Nonfiction wise, well, other than Casey, whose work I, of course, am going to champion and promote, I'm in awe of quite a lot of my colleagues at the New Yorker. And a great way to find something to read is to read the magazine, figure out whose byline you really like, and go see what they wrote. It's its own little wonderful library. I am surely forgetting to mention a million things I love and adore, but I'll leave it at that for now. I think someone wanted to ask something live, which is always fun if we have another minute. I don't know if we do.
Yeah. Hi. I don't know how to type this out. It just seemed like very excessive. I really enjoyed this. I love the writing. I was not familiar with your work at all, but now I'm going to go looking for this other book as well. And actually, I was wondering why it's categorized as a memoir and whose decision that is, I guess, because I felt like there were like bits that were obviously very personal, but as you said, so much of it is an exploration. Like it could have almost been a book of sort of 3 essays, And so I was just, who decided this was a memoir?
That's a really great question, actually, and I'm glad you asked it, and it's a fun one to end on because it lets us think about kind of the book as a whole, but also books as a whole, and the real mystery of how we do sort them. Yeah, I mean, the taxonomy of book publishing is as mysterious to me as to anyone, I think. I I guess I should say I'm glad I wasn't the one who had to figure out how to position this book because I strongly agree. Left to my own devices, I probably would never have called it a memoir. Partly because, as I said, I'm not as in my element in that genre as I am in some others. On the other hand, like, what would I have called it? I think essays is reasonable, although I felt really strongly that I wanted the book to feel like a book, for each of the three parts to work together and constitute something kind of greater than the sum of its parts. So, like memoir, that's right, but an imperfect fit. Is it philosophy? Somewhat, but like also an imperfect fit and probably off-putting to some readers. So, and the truth is I experienced this with my first book too, where it's like, it got categorized everywhere from like philosophy to cognitive science to general nonfiction to self-help. Like if there was a shelf in a bookstore, unless it was like travel writing, someone was going to try jamming it into that shelf. And I suppose that problem is partly a reflection of how I like to write, which is a little bit across genres. It's a thing I love about my work as a journalist is I can go do science writing one day and travel writing another day, and then write about some beautiful novel a third day. And when I'm working at book length, I likewise really enjoy getting to kind of collapse some of those boundaries and move across them. But I suppose, I think ultimately someone at the publishing house, the editor and the publicist and the marketing team sit down together and collaborate on how to provide these kind of Library of Congress catalogs and these categories that booksellers use. And I guess I'm grateful to them because my understanding is memoir is a little bit of a better selling category than, for instance, philosophy. But I know what you mean. It's a tricky fit. And as I said, I'm glad I wasn't the one who had to make the decision.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking.
I think it's kind of interesting because, like you said, because it was dubbed memoir, it probably found its way into a lot of people's hands that would not normally have found it had it have been in essays or even philosophy. So, I mean, that's probably a good thing in some ways.
Probably, yes. As I said, I'm grateful to whoever did make that choice.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathryn, so much for your time and for writing such a beautiful book. And we're just so thrilled that it found its way to us. And we will look out for whatever comes next, whenever that is. What you were talking about sounds brilliant. So I hope that you write it sooner than later. But until then, you can always find Kathryn's writing stories all the time. So you just need to look up her name and you'll be able to find them online.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy getting to talk to you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a good night.
Thank you.